Hello, everybody. This is Jennifer Matarese, and before I get started with the episode today, I'd just like to take care of the usual housekeeping. For starters, paid requests are now reopened. If you're interested in submitting a disaster request, please double check the list of requests I most recently posted to the podcast's Facebook and Tumblr accounts to make sure your request has not already been made. Also, please look through past episodes to verify I haven't already covered the disaster in question. To submit a request, you can send a donation of $30 or more to the podcast PayPal at disasteraria@mail.com, on Venmo at Disaster Area Podcast, or on Cash App at Disaster Area Pod. Just add the name of the disaster to the notes on your donation. If you have an idea for an episode subject, but you're not sure if it qualifies, feel free to message me and I can approve one way or the other. The thing is, if you think it's a disaster, I probably think it's a disaster too. The subject from this particular episode was requested by Eric, and I'd like to thank them for the request and for the donation. If you'd still like to help support the podcast in another way, you can do so with a one-time donation through PayPal, Venmo, or Cash App, or on a per-episode basis through Patreon at www.patreon.com/disasterareapodcast. A per-episode donation of even as little as $1 an episode can help me do things like pay the rent and keep the lights on. And if you do join the Patreon, you will get new episodes ad-free as soon as I record them, rather than waiting until they are released. So if you do become a patron, I would very much appreciate it. You can also follow the podcast on Facebook at Disaster Area Podcast, on Instagram at Disaster Area Pod, and on Tumblr at Disaster Area-Podcast. Also, please think about rating and reviewing the podcast on Apple Podcasts, Audible, Spotify, or wherever else that you might listen to us on. And as always, the sources for each new episode can be found at disasterareapodcast.wordpress.com and in the episode description wherever you might be listening to me. With all of that taken care of, thank you very much for listening, and welcome to Disaster Area. Episode 244, The Sinking of the SS Atlantic, Part 1, April 1st, 1873. At least 535 deceased, hundreds injured. Ah, Nepo babies. Who doesn't love watching someone who's completely unqualified get a job because one or both of their parents know or are the person who's doing the hiring? Now, that's not to say people who go into the family business and are able to access advantages others might not be able to because of familial connections never deserve what they get. We tend to think of Nepo babies in regards to celebrity children who get jobs far easier than others might because everyone knows who their dad is or their mom is the producer. But just because you can get the job with your name doesn't mean you want to, or even that you keep it because you have the talent to back it up. For every poor Kardashian kid shoved into the limelight to badly belt out, "I just can't wait to be king" in front of hundreds of people, there are actually talented Nepo babies, quote unquote, like Jamie Lee Curtis, Liza Minnelli, Laura Dern, just to name a few. My point is, anybody can go into the family business, whether it be law, medicine, business, agriculture, or the arts. But at least with celebrities, an undeserved job provided by or because of family members will mostly result in some public humiliation. In other careers, it can actually get people killed. In the late 1860s, the White Star Line, the future owner of the Titanic, were in what we might politely call a transitional period. It had been around for decades, but as of late, the company was getting a little rough around the edges. Enter Thomas Henry Ismay, who snapped up the White Star Line in 1867 with the intention of turning it back into a force to be reckoned with. Ismay hooked up with Gustav Schwab, who invested with the company under the condition any new ships they wanted to build be constructed at Harland and Wolff, a new shipbuilding company out of Belfast, Ireland. Harland and Wolff was owned by Schwab's nephew, which is why he set that condition. They actually had a pool game one day. They were playing billiards and they talked it out. It's exactly the sort of business deal that would be done over a golf game today. That, for the record, is not the Nepo baby part of the story. Those of you who are interested in the sinking of the Titanic, and even just those of you who've watched the movie, may have had your ears perk up at the sound of the name Ismay. For those of you who don't know, J. Bruce Ismay was the chairman of the White Star Line when Titanic was constructed and was aboard the ship on her first, last, and only voyage. Ismay is best known to history for casually taking a space on board a lifeboat that night when so many others on his ship could not, and being publicly derided for doing so in the aftermath. Thomas Ismay was his father. When Ismay took over the White Star Line, he did so with the intention of moving the company from wooden sailing ships, iron sailing ships, and into steamships. The White Star Line formed a partnership with Harland and Wolff. The line would order the ships, and Harland and Wolff would build them. The first ship completed by Harland and Wolff for the White Star Line in 1870 was the Oceanic, followed by the SS Atlantic, the subject of our story, along with 4 other ships to come. All of them were cranked out in a 2-year span, with the Oceanic class of ships the biggest in the world outside of the SS Great Eastern. It was actually the Oceanic and the Atlantic specifically that were bigger, they were almost bigger than the Great Eastern. Now, trying to restart the heart of a dying company means pinching pennies where they could. You do what you can to save a little money here so that you can splurge a little here. And in one way in which the White Star Line made an effort to save money was by not making its American destination New York City, like so many other shipping companies. Instead, the ship docked in Jersey City, New Jersey, which, if you're hearing that as somebody who is not from America, does not know American geography, that sounds like it is far away. But Jersey City, New Jersey is right across the Hudson River from the southern tip of Manhattan. So basically, you're docking across the river. It's the same area. It is not anything. It saves money, but it is not much of a stretch when it comes to distance. The SS Atlantic was one of those ships that bridged the gap in nautical history between the sailing ships of yore and the steamships which would dominate the business of immigration for decades. Because of that, the Atlantic looked a little like if the Titanic and the Black Pearl had a baby. The ship was half the size of what Titanic would be, with only one funnel instead of the paddle wheel of other contemporary steamships that were kind of growing out of that. 4 sailing masts also rose up from the ship's upper decks, mostly just as a backup in case of an accident or engine failure. Then you have these masts and these big sails that you can use to continue your trip across the Atlantic or wherever else you may be traveling. The Atlantic measured 421 feet, or 128 meters long, and 41 feet, or 12.5 meters across, and weighed 3,707 gross tons. Along with a lack of a paddle wheel and its steel hull, the Atlantic also possessed several other, more modern features, like steam-powered steering, which is far easier than the earlier methods. It's a lot like power steering compared to other kinds of steering. Steam heat in all of the cabins, although you couldn't adjust it. It was basically steam going through pipes which ran through the cabins and the dorms where the steerage passengers would sleep, and you couldn't adjust it. You couldn't turn a knob. There was no, there's no thermostat. You're just getting warm pipes going through. So it could be hotter than you would like, but it's better than being freezing cold, I suppose. And telegraph communications with the men in the engine room. So they didn't have to keep running down and coming back up again. They could just send a message, text them and get a message back sooner or later. The Atlantic's power plant ran thanks to their two-cylinder 600 horsepower compound engines. On board were 10 boilers to feed the ship's engines, along with 1 boiler simply to keep the machinery on deck running. Despite all of the innovations with the rest of the ship, however, the rooms and the hallways were lit throughout with oil lamps rather than electricity. It also had a very large propeller. It had 4 blades. It was really big. It's all these advancements. They were really trying to, move forward, but there's only so much you can do. You kind of have to work with what you have. There's places where Ismay had to save money, but there's also places where he tried to splurge a little. So you really had to, it's a balance when you're trying to save a company. The Atlantic and its sister ships were some of the fastest on the seas, with blue ribboned awards for the fastest commercial transatlantic crossings under their belts. Now, I say blue ribboned, it's actually spelled RIBAND, not blue ribbon. It's an award that lots of White Star Line ships, and as far as I know, I think also Cunard ships did get some of those over time, but this was something that you aspire to because it's something you really brag about. Our ships go really fast. First launched on November 26th, 1870, the Atlantic didn't exactly have the cleanest record when it comes to safety. Not long after she was first launched, a night watchman was walking up the gangplank to the ship, slipped, and drowned after falling into the water beside the ship. It was actually very low. It was only a couple of feet, I think, or 3 feet, something along those lines. And yet he'd been knocked out, as far as I can tell, and so he drowned. Then another time, another ship, the steamer Alexandria, bumped into the Atlantic in Liverpool, which is where it would leave from. Every time it departed from the United Kingdom, from England, it would leave from Liverpool and then usually stop in Queenstown and then continue going until it got to Jersey City. So it wasn't perfect, but that's not bad, considering there are some ships that had lots worse records. I mean, that is a record that Titanic actually is not even that good. Titanic, there were more people who died in the construction of the Titanic, and it almost got into an accident with, I believe, the New York, if I'm remembering correctly. I'm obviously focused on the Atlantic, so my mind is a little fuzzy on that. But it came very close to having a terrible accident and didn't, thank God, when it was pulling out of one of the harbors, because the New York was right there and it sort of pulled it into its wake. The way it was churning was so huge. So, the Atlantic's history is a little muddy, but nobody's walking out of the shipbuilding industry without a little smudge under those. The White Star Line needed to make money, and the bread and butter of the shipping industry in the 1870s was in transporting poor passengers and steerage. You'd pay $33 then, which obviously that's a respectable amount of money in 1870, and you would be able to travel with your family. You're paying $33 for each one of them, I imagine. You're all going over to North America, to Canada, the United States, maybe Mexico, if that's your thing, going there to start over and make a new life. The thing about traveling aboard a ship in steerage at the time and in the decades surrounding it was that you were separated by gender, age, and marital status. This was something that had started from the very start of steamboat travel. Single people in steerage were separated by gender. Women on one end of the ship, men on the other, with married folks in the middle as a buffer zone so the single men wouldn't bother the women. We've been doing this forever, apparently. The same held for the Atlantic. The men were in the bow, and the women and children were in the stern. The married couples were between the single women and saloon class, which would be first class on these White Star Line ships. The steerage passengers on Atlantic were practically spoiled in comparison to other ships. They got bedding for their dormitory-style beds, which sounds like a low bar to us, but was practically luxury considering the alternatives. They had a kind of a hospital on the men's end of the ship where they could go and get treated for any sort of, medical problems they might have. They were getting, 3 squares a day, so that's pretty good for people who may not be getting that when they're not on a ship. So it was really pretty good traveling for steerage passengers. On March 20th, 1873, the Atlantic parked itself out in the middle of the River Mersey in Liverpool, where a White Star Line tender named Traffic would bring passengers, luggage, and other items out to the ship. Now, the Traffic was the only ship that the White Star Line had as of their Ismay getting the company that wasn't built by Harland and Wolff, which is not anything important. It's just something that seems, like, they built it somewhere else for some other reason. But the reason that they needed the tender was because the Atlantic was simply too big to dock in Liverpool. I believe, as far as I know, it also had the same problem in Queenstown, and I'm assuming in Jersey City as well, where instead of docking, the tender was needed to pick up passengers and luggage and all of that and bring it out to the ship in the middle of the river, or off the coast, or wherever it was parked. In Liverpool, the Atlantic picked up mostly its saloon class passengers. So, the rich, the business people, the lawyers, and all these people that had some money to spend. The crew would wait for high tide so the ship could exit the River Mersey by passing over the sandbar at its opening. Then it headed for Queenstown, Ireland, where it would pick up a great many of its steerage passengers, headed to North America to start over abroad. For both groups, the crew provided a list of the other passengers for socializing purposes, which I as somebody with anxiety, I think gives me the willies, something terrible. A map of the ship so you could find your way around, and a map detailing the path across the Atlantic, which the ship would be following, so you could kind of follow your process across the Atlantic. It reminds me of, I don't want to describe what it's called because the term is questionable at best, but the new thing that people are doing for some reason, I don't know why, which is basically getting on a plane. You don't listen to music, you don't read a book, nothing like that. All you have to entertain you is the monitor in front of you that's showing the pathway that your plane is traveling, and I can tell you right now, I am sleeping through that entire flight. I am not staying awake if I don't have a book or music to listen to, or puzzles to do, or something along those lines. At the head of the Atlantic was her captain, James Agnew Smith. Agnew Williams, excuse me. I'm thinking of the Titanic again. No. And my autocorrect corrected Agnew, like Spiro Agnew, the former United States Vice President, to Agnes, which is one of those old lady names that I love. But that was not his middle name. As per usual, there was a hierarchy of other officers underneath Williams to care for the ship as she traveled across the Atlantic. Obviously, Williams can't be awake 24 hours a day. You need other officers around in, first, second, third, all of that to help take care of the ship. This included Chief Officer John Firth, Second Officer Henry Metcalf, Third Officer Cornelius Brady, and Fourth Officer John Brown. Now, here's where the Nepo baby part of the episode kicks in. 26-year-old Henry Metcalf wasn't just the second officer. He was also Henry Ismay Metcalf, the first cousin of Thomas Ismay. Metcalf first went to work on the sea at the age of 16, just like others in his family. In 1867, when he was 19, he earned his second mate certificate from the British Board of Trade, and the following year served as second mate aboard the Explorer, a White Star Line ship. His cousin Thomas had bought the company the year earlier, so Metcalf had an in. Now, the year when Ismay bought it and when he kind of starts helping his cousin by giving him these jobs, I believe I said 1867 was the year that he bought it earlier. It's, basically this is when this is all going on, when he's right in the position to help his cousin get a proper job. So Metcalf has this in. A year later, he gets his first mate certificate, and with it becomes the chief officer of the Explorer. So far, so good. And I jinxed it. On April 21st, 1869, First Officer Metcalf was in charge of the bridge on the Explorer in the early morning hours on a perfectly normal night. No storms, no fog, just a lovely night off the coast of Brazil. It's a beautiful night. There's no reason that there should be any trouble whatsoever, which, of course, means there will be. Then the Explorer ran over something. That something was the French ship Bretagne, a little wooden ship that was a toy next to the Explorer, but not for long. Before I go on, I did want to say that if you've heard the word Bretagne and you're like, that reminds me of something, Bretagne was was the name of one of the dogs who went to Ground Zero on 9/11 to help look for survivors. And that was actually the longest surviving dog who helped at Ground Zero. So as soon as I saw that name, I just thought of this, beautiful golden retriever who had to go do this very difficult job. And so that's what that did to me. But anyway, let's continue. The Bretagne went down in a handful of minutes. It completely sunk in 10 minutes, and took 5 people down with it, including the captain. His wife and 8 other survivors were brought aboard the Explorer, then taken closer to the coast of Brazil and dropped off. They basically just put them in the lifeboat from the Britannia, which they had been floating in when the ship sank, and then put them back in, gave them provisions, oars, everything that they needed, and then sent them to Brazil to go do whatever it is that they needed to do before the Explorer continued onward. When they reached their destination in Melbourne, Captain Edward Trumbull reported the collision with the Britannia, and an investigation began to see what was the problem. That's when the helmsman of the Explorer shared some slightly embarrassing information about Chief Officer Metcalf. See, because of the helmsman's position on the bridge, on the ship where he was standing, he couldn't see past the typical things you would expect to see on the deck of a sailing ship like the Explorer. Masts, sails, ropes. That's a lot of obstruction. There's a lot of things that you can't see past. So it was the officer in charge who needed to stand forward and alert the helmsman to anything in the ship's path. It was his job to stand up there and look forward and say, you have to turn to port, you have to turn to starboard, there is something in the way. That was his job. Chief Officer Metcalf probably would have done that when it came to the Britannia if it weren't for the fact he'd fallen asleep on top of the chicken coop, which sounds like an excuse you give for forgetting to milk the cows today, not the reason you hit a boat and kill 5 people. That is not an excuse you get. I fell asleep on top of the chicken coop. Not good. Not good. Because of this, the inquiry ruled Metcalf guilty of negligence and suspended his first mate certificate for 1 full calendar year. But the nice thing about having a cousin who owns a shipping company is that when your license suspension is lifted, you can hop right back in the saddle again. And Metcalf did, right onto the White Star Line ship Singapore. Oh, but it gets better. In 1872, 24-year-old Metcalf. Now keep in mind, all of this is happening when he is in his early 20s. So he is just screwing up left and right in his early 20s. Now, we've all done some pretty silly things in our early 20s and our late teens and our 20s, 30s, whatever. We have done some silly things. Things that we regret. Sinking another ship is not one of them for most of us. Now, in 1872, 24-year-old Metcalf got his master's certificate, which meant he could be a captain of any one of White Star Line's ships. Be forewarned. He was promptly made captain of the Compadre. The Compadre left San Francisco on February 21st, 1872, with Metcalf, 2 officers, and 15 other crew members. When it ended its 11-month journey in Liverpool the following January, 14 of the crew members had deserted, and the main reason the 15th guy hadn't was because 2 weeks into the trip, he fell out of the rigging and hit the deck, breaking his neck. Now, I've worked jobs with high turnover, but that is impressive. It was not unusual for sailors to abandon ship, to desert ships when they would reach port. If they just decided, you know what, I like San Francisco, I'm staying here. You know what, I like New York, I'm staying here. I like London, I'm staying here. They would just leave, and there's nothing really you could do about it. So it wasn't unusual, but for every single sailor that you left with at the start of the journey to be gone when you get to your destination, your final destination, that's impressive. Not only did Metcalf sink a ship, but he also did such a fantastic job as captain that everybody quit. And one guy quit a lot, forever. So, of course, Thomas Ismay put his cousin right back into an officer position on one of his ships, this time on the Atlantic. So, this is the guy you have as second officer of the Atlantic when it leaves on its 19th voyage in 1873. When Atlantic departed Queenstown, Ireland for its 19th voyage across the the ocean whose name it shared, it carried 952 people on board. Technically, 117 of those were crew members, while nearly all of the rest were passengers. I say nearly because 14 of them weren't exactly passengers. They were stowaways. So were two more of the passengers, although they didn't exactly intend to be stowaways. The two were infants, born sometime between the time Atlantic left Liverpool and the day a week and a half later when the ship would meet its fate. As for the 14 stowaways, they didn't just pop up all at once. They're stowaways. They're not supposed to be found. So they're hiding somewhere, and you just find them as you're going through the ship. Like, oh, there's a stowaway. There's another stowaway. Found another one. Like, you can't just pitch them overboard in the middle of the Atlantic because they stowed away, so they had to stay on the ship. What happened when they got to port, that was another thing entirely. They could get off, they could go back. They had to make a decision then, I suppose. But I tried to look up because, as I remember correctly, when I was doing the Ancestry.com family tree thing for my family, back in these days, back at the turn of the century, between the 1800s and 1900s, around that time, when you came into the United States, it was a perfectly, normal way to get into the country to have stowed away on a ship. It was one of the things that you could check off when you filled out how you came here. Like, one would be passenger, and then another one, there's stowaway. And it's just like, well, is that legal? Who knows? It's just on the paperwork. But it's the fact that you could do that, just stow away on a ship and get over to America is, it's a big difference compared to all of the immigration issues and, complaints that we have now. But let's get past that. Before the Atlantic could depart for its trip across the ocean, which shares its name, it needed to fill up on coal. For a week prior to the voyage, for a week before they got to Liverpool and starts loading up these saloon passengers, men carried basket after basket of coal up the gangplank of the Atlantic to fill up the coal bunker. To get the Atlantic from one side of the ocean to the other required 967 tons of coal. Chief Engineer John Foxley oversaw all of this, taking careful note of just how much coal the ship contained. Almost everyone who's had a job has been in a position where you kind of have to work around your boss's expectations. At my weekend job, my boss knows I can complete 100 units in a shift. The fact that that's if everything goes perfectly, if I don't have to slow down for any reason, if I work my butt off for 12 straight hours, doesn't exactly sink in sometimes. The fact it's so exhausting, I'm too tired to do it again the next night all over again, I'm still going to be encouraged to try and do it every single night, without fail, sometimes even when we don't even have 100 units for me to complete, or we don't have the equipment, which I have a rant about this that I have given to my supervisor multiple times. I can't do what you want me to do if you don't give me the tools to do it and the product to do it with. So this is something that I think we've all had to deal with, though, is that you sometimes have to tell your boss what they want to hear to get the job done. So sometimes you fudge a little. I can't do 100 units tonight. This type takes longer than usual. I can't do 100 units tonight. No one's prepared them beforehand, so I can do them, and so I have to wait to start. I can't do 100 units tonight. The next shift is coming in early, and that's less time for me to work. It's not exactly lying. All of those reasons affect my output. But I am very good at my job, and even with those restrictions, I could probably still get 100 units a night. If I wanted to cap off every single work night with a panic attack. So what does this have to do with the price of eggs in China? Well, the Chief Engineer Loxley, and Captain Williams had a very special relationship. Special in that captains could tend to annoy the crap out of the Chief Engineer. They wanted to get from one shore to another as quickly as possible, and they didn't pay too much attention to just how much was left in the gas tank, so to speak. A chief engineer like Foxley knew exactly how much coal was on board the ship, almost down to the smallest chunk. But telling the captain that exact amount every day tended to encourage them to keep on pushing the ship as fast as they could. It's a bit like when you're broke and your gas gauge in your car is nudging perilously close to the E. So you start doing the math. You can still drive on fumes for a while. You have to go to this job or the other job. You can coast down certain hills to see how long it's going to be until you have no choice but to go to the gas station and look under your car seats for loose change. Which, as someone who's turning 47 next month, I can tell you worked a lot better to pay for a gallon of gas to get you home in 1994 than it does now. I don't know many people my age who watch Die Hard and don't kind of pause and laugh at the scene where Reginald VelJohnson's character is in the fast food place and he gets called to go to the Nakatomi Tower, and he walks out and he goes to look at the tower, and beside him is the sign with the gas prices, and it is like 75 cents. So many people my age just like having flashbacks to childhood, like, oh man, do I miss that. But you take what you can get. Anyway, back to the voyage across the Atlantic. The ship's first couple of days on their week-and-a-half voyage was fine. The crew was able to complete a lifeboat drill just before departing from Queenstown, and on the Sunday following, they did another at-sea lifeboat drill as well. Their timing was impeccable. As the day progressed, on Sunday, the weather turned. Monday, the Atlantic struggled through stormy weather, pushing as hard as it could to get not nearly as far as normal. I imagine what is probably always happening in the North Sea. If you've ever seen video of the North Sea, and I know I've talked about disasters that happen on the North Sea before, I've talked about what it looks like, but if you ever look up video of what happened on the North Sea, what the waves look like there, they're huge. And when you're on a ship, they just look, no matter how big the ship, it feels so small to be on that ship and be going over these huge waves that look like hills, if not mountains, depending on just how bad the sea is. So all of these people are on the Atlantic. They are trying to travel across the ocean to their new life. And as they're doing this, the ship is just going up and down and up and down and up and down. You can imagine how this is affecting every single person on board. And that's where the trouble started in the engine room. Here they are. They're trying to get across the sea. They're pushing and pushing and pushing. They are throwing coal into these boilers to get the ship to go, and it is not going as far as possible. See, chief engineers weren't supposed to lie about the coal and how much was available to the captains. You're supposed to tell them exactly how much you got. You go up and you say, we have 500 tons. That's what you have to work with. But they did lie. And that includes Chief Engineer Foxley. From that stormy Monday onward, Foxley started fudging his numbers when he reported the daily coal stores to Captain Williams. At first, he just shaved off a few tons. Nothing too noticeable, just a few tons here or there, we don't have, we have 1 or 2 tons less, that kind of a thing. But as the days passed, Foxley's fudging got bigger. While Chief Engineer Foxley was throwing out bogus numbers, the passengers on board were throwing up everything they ate. On rough seas and steaming through storms, the Atlantic felt like a small car on an enormous roller coaster. Everybody got seasick. One of the few lifeboats smashed to pieces when struck by fierce waves. It was still in its davit. They're going through all of this, and these waves are hitting them, and it breaks one of these lifeboats apart. So now they're down one lifeboat, which is not good when you only have so many. Food being stored on the upper decks washed away. So they had like potatoes and salted fish and stuff that they were storing up on deck, and that just completely washed right off the deck. It didn't matter as much, though, because everyone could only stomach things like broth and gruel anyway. At some point when they're dealing with all of this coal and how low the numbers are getting, even though Chief Foxley isn't really telling the truth about that, Captain Williams is like, hey, kitchen staff, why don't you not use so much coal to run the kitchen? And the kitchen staff were basically like, dude, we have basically shut the kitchen down. All we're making is soup. There's really nothing that we are wasting coal on. You're going to have to try somewhere else. The food is being stored for added fun to prevent any of the oil lamps from breaking as the Atlantic was flung around by the ocean and setting the ship alight. The crew had nearly all of the lamps put out, leaving hundreds of sick people vomiting in the dark. Now, this already sounds gross enough, but the book that I used as one of the sources for this mentioned that there was so much throwing up going on that the floors were slippery. And that is probably one of the grossest things I have ever heard on this podcast. And that's saying a lot on a disaster podcast. Just people were just throwing up constantly. And I should really stop talking about that because it's making me nauseous. But that's the problem that they're having on this ship, is just everybody's sick. They can't get fast enough. Things are just going wrong. This whole trip is a nightmare. Chief Engineer Foxley kept telling Captain Williams lower and lower numbers in the hopes he would slow down. But it didn't work. On Friday, March 28th, Foxley reported 319 tons of coal. They had more than that, obviously. On Monday, the 31st, Foxley reported 127 tons of coal, not nearly enough to reach Jersey City from where they were. There were actually 160 tons of coal in the bunker, which would get them to Jersey City just fine. Chief Engineer Foxley had painted himself into a corner, where admitting the true tonnage would make it clear he'd been lying about the Atlantic's coal supply for days. He really didn't have a choice. He gets the captain, who comes to him and goes, look, how much coal do we have, and do we have enough to get to Jersey City, or are we going to have to go to Halifax in Nova Scotia, go up there, get some more coal, and then continue the journey? He could tell the captain, you know what, I have been lying this whole trip, and we have enough to get to Jersey City. Or he can, kind of admit defeat and just kind of keep going and go, yeah, I guess we got to go to Halifax, which it doesn't sound like that bad of a thing, but no White Star Line ship had to do this before. This is a point of pride. You didn't want to be able to do this. And so this is going to make the captain look bad. It's going to make the Atlantic crew look bad. And Chief Foxley just has no choice. Chief Engineer Foxley, he just has no choice. He's backed himself into a corner, and now he's SOL, basically. They turn northward toward Halifax to resupply. At the position that they're at that point, they literally just turn right and go straight north, and they're heading towards Nova Scotia. As the clock ticked over to midnight on April 1st, 1873, the SS Atlantic continued to steam straight northbound toward the southern shores of Nova Scotia. While Chief Engineer Foxley might have felt a little queasy about where his lies were now heading the ship, especially considering the hell which might come to pay when they reached Jersey City and they had to contact the White Star Line about what had happened, others on the ship were looking forward to the stop in Halifax. Remember, this has been an awful journey. This is terrible. People are throwing up everywhere. Everybody's sick. It's awful. The kitchen staff could restock their lost potatoes and saltfish, among other things. So they started actually using all of their supplies to make better food. The seas were not as rough. People could start stomaching better food. And so they were able to start putting that energy into making the passengers, more hearty meals. The passengers could get off and stretch their legs on land once again, even if it meant they would need to get back on the ship soon enough. They just, they could get up, they could walk around, they could get off of this horrifying ship that they've been on for a week and a half at this point, and they can go and just relax for a little bit. I'm not sure how long it would have taken, considering it took a week to put something like 1,000 tons of coal on this ship. It may take a day or so for them to do that. Maybe they might have to stay overnight. Who knows? The point is, people on board this ship were really looking forward to the fact that they could get off and walk around. For now, the passengers and crew would just have to put up with the rough and ready seas off the Nova Scotia coast. For days now, the Atlantic had been more of a roller coaster ride than a ship, and everyone's poor stomachs were the worse for it. Meanwhile, the crew were in the position of switching shifts at midnight on April 1st. The second and fourth officers replaced the first and third officers on the bridge, meaning Second Officer Metcalf was in charge. Captain Williams stopped by at 20 after midnight to check in. He stops at the bridge, just kind of checks in. Is everything good? All right. He then decided to go take a 3-hour nap, give or take, leaving those on the bridge with the instructions that he must be woken up at 3 a.m. when they estimated they'd arrive at the entrance to Halifax Harbor, where they could stay until after the sun rose. His instructions to the officers were kind of like a snooze alarm, given that he had also told his valet to bring him a cup of hot chocolate in his quarters at 2:40 a.m. and wake him then. So if the valet didn't come, then somebody from the bridge was supposed to go to Captain Williams and wake him up at 3 o'clock, no later. They were not supposed to go any later. They're looking for the entrance to Halifax Harbor. They're not going to go into Halifax at that time. It's nighttime. The seas, the shoreline at the southern coast of Nova Scotia is pretty messy. It's very rough and it's rocky. It's a beautiful place. If you go and look at pictures of this coastline, it is very beautiful on a sunny day when you're watching it. But, getting into a boat and going out in those waters is very hard. And so it is not something that you want to be approaching when you don't have a lot of experience with this particular area. Captain Williams didn't have any experience approaching Halifax. Not many people on the bridge did. Not many of the crew members did. There was a quartermaster Robert Thomas, who did have experience approaching Halifax. And so at least somebody on that bridge knew that the approach to Halifax was a dangerous one, and it was very technical, and they really needed to be careful. But the other officers on board were maybe a little bit more confident than they probably should have been. So that is where we're going to leave right now the SS Atlantic. It is getting ready to approach Halifax. Halifax Harbor is at the southern coast of Nova Scotia. I know I talked about it a lot in the episode on the Halifax explosion. If you want to go back and listen to that, it's a really interesting disaster. It's a really good disaster to read about hear about if you want to know about one of these great tragedies that struck this really gorgeous city. And so they're heading for this harbor. They're looking for a lighthouse. There's a lighthouse called Sambro Island Lighthouse, still there today. It is one of the oldest lighthouses on the continent. It would be, off to their left as they're approaching Halifax Harbor. And what they're going to do is they're going to see that lighthouse. They're going to, set anchor or whatever, and they're going to wait it out. And that's their plan. They just have to get there. The problem is, as we'll see in the next episode, they are not where they think they are. And like I said, there is a lot involved with what happens next. So that's why I wanted to get all of this set up before we get to the point where everything goes to hell. Everything goes bad. And so with that, I'm going to finish this off and say that until next time, stay safe.